at this point, it's been 25 years since 1990. In 1990, the treatment for ovarian cancer was pretty much platinum, 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 and platinum.
You did a few of those studies, Ted.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we did a lot of. But at the current time, we have this huge number of options that are available to us now. In fact, much larger than what we really talked about here this afternoon, because if you add them up, based on phase 2 data, you've got some 22, 23 different agents that have shown some activity in ovarian cancer. So how do you decide about when you use what in all of this sequencing? I mean, we're all pretty well agreed that Taxol, carboplatin, bevacizumab, those are the key agents in the frontline setting. And in the platinum-sensitive setting, some platinum-based combination, I think most people are agreed with. Mm-hmm. But in the platinum-resistant setting, you've got this plethora of drugs and plethora of options. How do you decide what to use there?
Well, the good news is a lot of the journey the patient's been through will help determine that. And what I mean by that is very often, and we all work in academic centers, and so we tend to get referrals from patients that have been heavily pretreated, and they've been on 2 or 3 of the regimens that might be your go-to regimen, and they failed it, and that obviously is going to provide you with the answers to what you're going to do next. So I think it's really hard in a platinum-resistant, especially a heavily pretreated platinum-resistant patient, to say what you're going to do until you know what she's been on prior, and to also know what toxicity she's incurred.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what's very interesting to me is that you have 2 FDA approvals last year.
Right.
The use of olaparib in that 4th-line therapy, and then you have the use of bevacizumab, which we were all using before that approval, right?
Yeah, sure.
But it was restricted to no more than 2 prior lines of therapy.
Right.
And what's interesting to me is I want to move one up higher and be able to use olaparib. You know, if somebody has a BRCA 1 or 2 mutation and they develop platinum-resistant disease, because some of them do earlier in their course, I want to be able to move that drug up higher and maybe continue to use Bev in later lines of therapy. And that's one of the things that I think is a clinical conundrum right now with FDA approval for these agents.
Yeah, and the other thing is, as Tom mentioned, that we try to give our best therapies as proximal as possible. I think because we do lose patients between lines of therapy.
That's why you don't use frontline Bev, because you use the best agents that we have frontline?
Best.
Oh, that was not
I told
nice.
you. What did I tell you? What did I tell you?
Did you not listen? You don't listen.
He didn't listen. Did he listen?
No, he wasn't listening.
Okay. All right, just want to make sure.
I just had to poke you. We were getting a little stale there, so I'm just spicing it up.
Yeah, so we know that we lose about 20% of
Right.
patients per cycle. So
Right.
I mean, per course of strategy of regimen.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I would like. It's hard to say I'm going to save something for later, but we do take the antecedent toxicities, the expectations, and the convenience of schedule into account at every line of therapy that we do. And I think we always have to ask the question, and Angeles has done a great job of this as well, of trying to say, is this of benefit or not of benefit to the
Right.
patient at every decision point?
I want to publicly thank Tom, because what Tom has done, and working with all of you as well, is to try to change the world that progression-free survival is an endpoint that can lead to new agents. So none of the agents that we've talked about today has a clear survival benefit.
Correct.
So I think that has been a good evolution, Tom. I don't know if you want to say progression-free survival is probably a good endpoint for drug approval?
Well, I think, and I want to thank everybody that's on this panel, because we've all participated, everybody that's at the table. It's been a group team effort through the Society of Gynecologic Oncology, where we've written a couple of white papers and an opinion paper that have really looked at this whole role of, can we use something else other than overall survival? And what we were finding was, first of all, there was an 8-year gap in any drug approvals for ovarian cancer. And that was very concerning to us, because we clearly need to do better with these patients, and we need to keep those curves moving upward. So with that concern, we started looking at some of the reasons why we had a lack of development, and one of the reasons was that largely pharma had felt that the messaging from the FDA was, you need to show OS. And the problem with that is you have confounding of the treatment. And with such a long post-progression survival that we see in ovarian cancer, it makes it very difficult. The power of the study diminishes greatly, and you need thousands of patients. And the length of the study and the cost of the study need to be taken into account. And you're looking at a study, well, look at 212. We're looking at a study that, what, is in 15 years out, something? You know, so with the pace of discovery today, it's no longer acceptable to have a study that's not going to report out for 12 to 15 years because it'll be irrelevant by the time it reports out.
That's right.
And so for all these reasons, we started looking at surrogate endpoints. We sat down with Mark Brady from Stats. We sat down with other people. And we sat down with the FDA, which has been the most important part of this.
We got to show them some props because I think that
Yes,
working with the
absolutely.
working with the SGO, I think we had an opportunity to have a frank discussion that was really unprecedented, and I have to give those guys a lot of
the
credit.
FDA gets credit.
Yeah,
that's
because
right.
they
Because two agents in 2014, first targeted therapy,
neither
is
of
a
which with
breakthrough.
OS, right?
That's my point, and that's why I think that we need to recognize that.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about these agents, this process, this mechanism.
The last 3 approvals, in fact, have all been based on PFS.
But not just
or
those
response.
endpoints alone. It also had to do about quality of
That's
life
right.
issues
Yeah,
and
that's true.
symptoms as well. So
You've been a big advocate.
Patient-reported
right?
outcomes, quality of life, all these measures are also becoming increasingly
So
more
it's a
important.
changing ball field, and I think that's a good thing.
Yes.
Okay, well, continuing with the discussion of appropriate endpoints then, the FDA now has approved 3 drugs based on progression-free survival. Olaparib, gemcitabine in combination with carboplatin, and bevacizumab in the platinum-resistant disease setting. Do you think now that progression-free survival becomes our optimal primary endpoint for clinical trials in ovarian cancer?
I mean, yes, with caveats, though. It
that's right.
has to be a sufficient prolongation of tumor stabilization and disease control to be clinically meaningful, has to be associated with a level of adverse events and toxicities that we can stand, and ideally even associated with improvement in patient-reported outcomes.
Yeah.
And with no detriment.
In overall survival.
yes.
Okay,
That's a
so
good summary.
what constitutes an adequate prolongation in progression-free survival, since you've named that as one of your criteria?
Well, I think it depends on the setting. So asymptomatic patients in frontline maintenance need more benefit because it's a different scenario. But as opposed to platinum-resistant disease, which is where bevacizumab now is labeled, it was only 3 months. So it depends on the setting. Frontline has got to be more than platinum-resistant disease.
That's where your hazard ratio is helpful. And how many assessment cycles is key. So you got to have at least 2 assessment cycles.
I think as a rule of thumb, it's when you use PFS, which is a potentially a biasable endpoint, it's hard to have a biasable endpoint past 2 assessment cycles. I mean, it's just harder to. It can happen certainly, but it's harder to get through 2 assessment cycles and still say patients clinically benefiting when there's growing disease. So that's a good rule of thumb. But I think the key thing about PFS is the question that FDA has asked us many times is why? Why is 3 months better? Tell me
and
why
that's
it
why I
is.
said ideally associated with improvement in patient-reported outcomes.
So the key to that answer to Tate's question is really how do we put context around whatever we see? And Angeles, what do you think?
Well, that's been something I've been trying to do, but the hard thing is what endpoints do you use? So one thing that we were interested in evaluating is could you do a composite endpoint? So the problem is what endpoint do you use? Can you use PFS just as a median months in survival, or do you need 6-month progression-free? What type of quality of life parameters do you use? And then how do you really address toxicity? Is it using our standard toxicity assessment, or is it toxicity that causes discontinuation of therapy? So these are all questions that I need you to help me answer so that we could come up with the right endpoint.
So the EMA has a document about this very issue, and they opine that PFS2, the second time to progression, so that if you can have a progression-free survival improvement now, and that is maintained in the next line of therapy, and if the time to subsequent therapy is also delayed, that also helps it put into context. So there's kind of 3 ways: PROs, PFS2, time to subsequent treatment, and again, I think it's the package that allows us to get approval.
All that sounds good, except for a couple of caveats. Number one, the FDA's position is they've never approved a drug based on PRO endpoints.
Alone.
Okay,
And
alone.
that-
That's not what I'm implying.
The second thing is that the FDA defines clinical benefit on its website as improvement in overall survival, which means that you can't have clinical benefit demonstrated by anything else unless you have an overall survival benefit. But the odds of seeing that in ovarian cancer, for that matter, breast cancer too, is diminishingly small with the large number of things we do to the patients after progression takes place.
That's right. So yeah, again, these are, we're trying to come up with good ways to measure benefit from, the addition of or the substitution of some therapy at one point in time. And I think that, and as you would do in a lab, without any confounding factors, if you can show that, arm A versus arm B is better, then that is better. But I think we all recognize that there are issues like toxicity, and we need to understand exactly what those things mean as we look at the overall measure of benefit. And I think one of the the key messages we got out of our discussions was that if you're getting benefit on an experimental therapy going forward, and you have to switch because you've progressed, let's say, on the control arm, if you can maintain whatever benefit from a quality of life standpoint into the next line of therapy, that actually provides additional context about why the PFS is important.
Exactly.
Except that you need to keep in mind that for newer agents, the trick is getting on the market so it can actually be used. And to do that, you have to be able to satisfy the regulators.
Sure. But
And
they're
up to
open
this
a dialogue.
point, none of those have been accepted as regulatory endpoints. I think that we're beginning to see a break in the dam with the approval of bevacizumab based on PFS. I thought the earlier approval of gemcitabine with carboplatin was it, but it wasn't.
Right.
And then olaparib based on PFS. So
Based on
hopefully,
response rate.
Well, Elaborate was
hopefully-
based on
Actually,
response
response.
rate.
well, okay.
Yeah,
But,
I mean, that's
but
even...
that was, well, okay. A lot of the approvals previously were response rates, but they are as accelerated approvals.
That's right. And this is...
And you now have to show something
Right.
in addition.
in terms of, well, their overall survival or hopefully progression-free survival will suffice.
Yeah.
I mean, the messaging we've gotten from the FDA is basically smaller, leaner, meaner trials. And the Kaufman trial is a good example with olaparib.
Earlier, it was mentioned that we had asked the question about what length of progression-free survival improvement would be meaningful. If you look at the best we've ever achieved in the GOG through 40 years of research was 6 months.
Yeah.
And that includes platinum, that includes the taxanes. So that by those definitions, 5 or 6 months is a huge improvement. 3 to 4 months ought to be adequate. So I think that we need to stop talking about 3 to 4 months as not being much improvement.
I don't know about that because I think if you ask our patients what they want, they don't think 3 to 4 months is adequate.
more.
I mean, you did a
more.
fantastic study, both Rob and Tom did, and they want more. And even in a study that we did, we asked them how much time in progression-free survival would you be willing to trade off to avoid certain toxicities, and they were willing to trade off up to 6.7 months to avoid certain toxicities. So we do have to listen to our patients in terms of having this discussion.
True. But if you take that in context, then I assume if you take that to heart, that you don't recommend platinum.
Why do you say that?
Because
Tell me
there's never been a PFS longer than 6 months. Difference longer than 6 months with platinum.
But I think we started with a building block, and we're building on that.
That's true.
And we didn't really have an idea of what our patients wanted at that point.
So now that you know, you're not giving platinum anymore?
That's not true.
I know it's not
That
true,
is
and that's the point I'm trying to make.
But
is
Tate,
that,
you have to
No,
put
but
that
you have
into
to-
context.
exactly.
And I'm an optimist, and we have so many different new drugs available with so many emerging in the pipeline that I do think it's fair to look to hold these to a little bit higher standard. And I do think the bar is somewhere between 4 and 6 months.
Depending on the setting.
4 and 6 months, I would say that's probably a reasonable assumption. But I think you have to be careful, or you end up with no new agents being available for use because they're not approved by the regulatory authorities. So we have to be very careful about that.